So, hello everyone. My name is Fernando. I am a professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and today I will talk a bit about the work that we do on tensor compilers here at UFMG. So, before that, let me just introduce you to our university and our city. So, we are located in Belo Horizonte, which is a large city in Brazil. It's the sixth largest city in Brazil, has a population of 2.4 million people. And within Belo Horizonte, we have a major software hub in Latin America. For instance, we have a very large development office from Google, one of the largest south of the equator. We also have the largest, well, south of the equator again, development office from Accenture. And we have a very large development office from Cadence. So yeah, there is a very healthy and robust ecosystem of software development in Belo Horizonte. And UFMG, the university, the Federal University of Minas Gerais, is located there. So it's a large university with 45,000 students, about 15,000 graduate students in master and PhD programs in many different majors. So, and within UFMG, we have the Compilers Lab, which is an academic research lab with contributions to the open source community. So there are several patches and important tools like SpiderMonkey from Firefox or LLVM, and even like the Mesa 3D compiler. For instance, if you look into the Mesa 3D, its source code cites a paper that was published in the Compilers Lab. So that was one of the first works that we did. That was in 2011 when we were actually working in the old building. I have moved to a new building since then. I mean, life has improved. So let me now talk about some of these contributions in the context of tensor compilers. So first, what is this? A tensor compiler is, they are tools like, for instance, XNNC or Apache TVM or MindSport. Essentially, they translate a high-level description of a neural network, say TensorFlow or ONNX or PyTorch, into hardware, which could be like a CPU, a GPU, a TPU, or an NPU, for instance. And today I will talk about contributions on two of those compilers, XNNC and Apache TVM. On XNNC, we did kernel fusion, and on Apache, we did something called autotuning, and I will explain those two things in a bit. So first, XNNC is a proprietary compiler. It belongs to Cadence, so it was developed by the Tensilica branch of Cadence. It's a compiler that translates floating point convolutional neural networks into highly optimized binaries that will run on Cadence DSPs. So this kind of neural networks, you can find them in vehicular networks, for instance, in appliances and things like that. So it's a relatively large compiler, is implemented in C++. It counts 1.5 million lines of code, but have to remember that's built on top of LLVM, so it includes the LLVM code base. And since last year, Cadence has hired 5 of our alumni from the Compilers Lab to work on the development of XNNC. And I will talk a bit about one contribution. So a tensor compiler essentially will see a neural network as a data structure that we call a computational graph. So I mean, here's an example of a computational graph. We essentially are picking up models written in high-level description languages like ONNX, and then converting those models into this format, and then from there we produce code that we run on DSPs. And then we can imagine that each vertex of a data structure like that, a computational graph, is a library call that implements an algorithm that we call a kernel. So a kernel is essentially an algorithm that runs some computation on a tensor. Tensors are the data that those tensor compilers manipulate. Think on them as multidimensional vectors. So something that a compiler like that can do is like, pick up two kernels and then combine them together into a single kernel that's available on the library of kernels. So that's what we call fusion. Let me explain better. So what's operator fusion? And that's an old optimization. If you look into classic compilers, so already in 1971, Francis Allen and John Cock had a catalog of transformations, and then fusion was included there. But they were essentially talking about fusion of loops. So, I mean, if you have like a succession of loops and they have the same shape, the same bounds, we can combine them into a single loop. So when you look into computational graphs, that's essentially what's happening. We're taking like a nest of loops and combine them into a single loop. However, here we are mostly talking about libraries. So let me give an example to illustrate how fusion happens in a modern compiler. So consider single-head attention. I mean, that sits at the core of all those LLMs. So single-head attention is a kernel, is a computational kernel that contains two matrix multiplications, transposition, scaling as well. So we can represent this formula as a kernel like this. Okay. So you see, you have operations, which are the kernels, and you have data, which are the tensors. But when you look into this, how a programmer writes single-head attention, essentially we will see a sequence of library calls, like this torch version of it. So each one of those library calls may map onto a highly optimized kernel that the Tensor compiler has access to. And something that's interesting is that it's possible to join some of those library calls into a single call. So that's what we call fusion, essentially. So what's the advantage? The advantage is that we can keep more data in memory, like resident in memory, so we avoid having to go back and forth in between the fast and the slow memory, for instance. So fusion tends to speed up the kernel execution on account of that. And then you may ask, so okay, why don't you simply fuse everything? Well, we could do that, of course, but there is a problem. I mean, if we fuse everything, we have to imagine that we have to keep more data in memory, and have like a hierarchies of fast and slow memory. And sometimes the data that we need to operate on it will not fit into the fast memory, because fast memory is kind of small, slow memory is plenty. And if that doesn't happen, we will have to operate with part of that data once at a time. And we may have to go back and forth between slow and fast memory. And so that may actually slow down the program. So, and that brings us to the first observation. Fusion, it improves performance, but not always. And deciding which operators to fuse is a very challenging problem that should be guided by a cost model. So what's a cost model? That's a function that takes a program and more or less estimates its performance. So I have lots of academic cost models. So this is the one that I took from a paper from Oliveri et al. That was published in 2021. So they can map, the parameters of a program onto these performance surfaces. And this is a cost model that we took from Cadence. So it's described in this paper that we published last year. So you see, it's really not a smooth surface. Essentially, to build this cost model, we take a program and then we kind of map each construction of that program into some cost function and then compose those functions, essentially. Anyway, so now that gives us the key problem that we need to solve. So given a computational graph, we need to find a sequence of operator fusions that minimize the cost of running that graph. There are many different ways of doing that described in the literature. There are exhaustive algorithms like this one that was published in 2023 from Kai et al. And then we have the evolutionary approach that we can find in Apache TVM. So that was published like 5 years ago. And then we have an algorithm that we call the minimum spanning tree that was a contribution from our group. So that was published in the International Conference on Compiler Construction this year, which happened in Las Vegas. So let me explain how the algorithm works. It's a greedy algorithm guided by a cost model, as I mentioned before. It groups nodes into clusters, and then it fuses the two most profitable clusters of nodes, if that's possible. Example. So imagine here that I have a program, like a computational graph. Vertices are kernels, edges are like data transfers. So we have a cost model, like a mock cost model. So edges have a cost, vertices have a cost as well. And let's imagine that we can fuse at will, except that we can never really make the cost of the edges in and out of a node exceed 5. I mean, if they did that before, that's fine, but I mean, after fusion, we can't really do that. So I mean, we have initially 5 clusters of edges. Each edge is its own cluster. So we need to decide which one to fuse, and then like the most profitable in this case, we need to consider the costs of eliding the edges, but also increasing the cost of the kernel. So in this case, I mean, the most profitable fusion that we have is like fusing AB, because that takes out this edge that has cost 4. So we fuse A and B. After that, I mean, we have like a few candidates, and then we decide that the best thing to do is to fuse A, B, and C. So we elide the edge that has cost 2. And then past this point, there's not really any fusion that we could do. And then we are done, essentially, with the algorithm. So that's pretty much how fusion works. So how good is this cluster-based algorithm? It's pretty good. Let me show you some examples. So we ran some tests on 19 convolutional neural networks. So those are like well-known models described in the ONNX format. They all are receiving the same image. They operate on images. So they are all receiving the same image. And I will be reporting the number of cycles that it takes to run those models. I mean, but this is simulation, so we're using XNNC Explorer, which is a cycle-accurate simulator. It's very accurate. And I will show some results for the P6, which is a DSP from Cadence. Anyway, so we shall compare 4 algorithms. I mean, there's a no algorithm that's like not doing fusion. So DFS was the original algorithm that was used on XNNC, and MST is the algorithm that I'm describing in this talk that I just illustrated with an example a bit before. And then EVL is the generic algorithm that's used in Apache TVM to perform fusion. So we took it from Apache TVM and implemented it in XNNC. All those numbers that I will show, they were produced by XNNC. And then BKT is backtracking, is an exhaustive algorithm that was published in 2023. So here are the results. I mean, lots of bars. Let's take a look into some of them. So first, regardless of the approach, fusing kernels is always good. Yeah, that always improves performance compared to no fusion. Okay. Then MST, like our algorithm, it improves performance over DFS, which was the original algorithm on XNNC, by 40% more or less. Okay. And then it's actually like better than the exhaustive approach. I mean, the exhaustive approach, of course, I mean, it would be always better unless it times out. So we experienced a few timeouts. So I mean, the algorithm couldn't really perform that well. And then compared to EVL, like the evolutionary algorithm, MST is pretty much like the same. Yeah, it doesn't really improve on that. However, it's much faster, so it runs faster. How fast? So let me show you some examples comparing compilation time. So this time, just like timing the compiler. So here are the results. What we noticed is that the exhaustive approach times out very often. I mean, we set a timeout of 1 hour. So I mean, doing backtracking to decide what's the best sequence of fusions is a very expensive problem, you know. And then the evolutionary algorithm is about 30% slower than MST. And so we conclude that, you know, MST is 30% faster than EVL, but generate codes that's equally as good. It's like 11% slower than DFS, but generate code that is 40% faster. The implementation is a bit larger than DFS, but it's much smaller, much shorter than implementation of the evolutionary algorithm. And this algorithm has been deployed on XNNC since early 2024 and is used in there, like in this industrial quality compiler. So now let me talk about another work that we did, this time on Apache TVM. So in contrast to XNNC, TVM is open source, and you did some work on it. So TVM takes, again, like models in different representations and convert those models into hardware like CPUs, TPUs, NPUs, and such. But what's interesting is that it separates the kernel view from the kernel implementation. So yeah, that's like an abstract representation of a matrix multiplication. That's more or less how TVM will see matrix multiplication, like some mathematical formula, you know. And then it has to implement it somehow. So yeah, it has like an intermediate representation that's used to implement those kernels. So yeah, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be showing everything in C. So that's a C representation of that abstract kernel on the left. And then TVM can run lots of optimizations on those kernels, like you know, you can interchange the order of the loops to get more locality, for instance. You can do something called tiling to, again, improve locality on the cache. It can do like different variations of tiling. I mean, tiling has a parameter. So in fact, there's a whole science of optimizations that we can run on these nests of loops. And what's interesting is that, like, again, some of those optimizations are parameterized. Like, imagine that I'm unrolling a loop. What's the unrolling factor? Or imagine that I'm tiling a loop. What's the size of the tiling window? So these parameters, they determine a space, an optimization space. And finding the optimal point in this space is a very difficult problem, actually. Yeah. And it's not clear how to do that, actually, even today. So, for instance, TVM has lots of different algorithms to find the right, version of a kernel, the right parameters for optimizations. For instance, it can do random sampling. I mean, samples different values for those parameters and try to get the best one. So that's something that it does. It can use a grid search, so it keeps varying the parameters on a grid in hopes of finding a good implementation of a kernel. So here I'm talking about a feedback loop. You try a version of a kernel, you run it, and then you collect the result and you run it again. Use those results to improve the next version of the kernel that you try to generate. So that's a very expensive process, very expensive compilation process. So TVM also has this evolutionary algorithm that tries to improve the kernel from generation to generation. Anyway, and since last year, since 2023 more or less, now it uses droplet search, which is an algorithm that we designed. So droplet search is a variation of hill climbing. So basically, we can charter the optimization space. We can define coordinates and assign those coordinates to each kernel. So essentially, the coordinates are the values of the parameters, for instance. And then we can determine a neighborhood of a kernel, and you can explore that neighborhood and keep exploring the direction where performance improves the best. So that's droplet search. And now it's used as a post-optimization pass. So, first, the meta schedule of answer of Apache TVM determines like a different optimization spaces, and then it samples those optimization spaces, and then it chooses the best sample that had seen, in that first exploratory phase, and then it exploits this point using a droplet search. So in the end, we converge to a better result. So droplet search was the PhD thesis of Michael Kanesk, who has been hired by Cadence. So, and it's used in TVM nowadays. So Michael published a number of papers out of that. So, I mean, they are like publicly available. And just an interesting number. If we run TVM on 300 samples, choose the best one and exploit it with droplet search, usually that will be better. That's consistently better than running TVM on 10,000 samples. So, and it's like a 60% faster. So, I mean, you can just explore a few samples and use that to exploit it with droplet search, and you get a better result. So, I mean, this is available on TVM, and you guys can use it. And that was pretty much what I had to tell you. So thank you very much. And if you have questions, you can write to me.